There's an unfortunate reality that people often glorify their ignorance. They glorify their ignorance in the name of ideology or religion or whatnot, and they use whatever justification to present their intentful, purposeful ignorance as somehow the correct way of thinking about the world or just inherently correct, and anything that goes against their worldview is incorrect. In other words, they will ignore all the facts, all the evidence, all the various disciplines of humanity, all the various subject matter that may possibly contradict or challenge them, and just stick to a certain set of facts, let's say. This often plays out in a few ways. Sometimes people ignore whole subjects or whole disciplines. Sometimes they will downplay their importance, or they will ostracize and, in certain unfortunate tragic cases, even persecute those who engage in said study of such subjects. This has been seen throughout history, for example, in certain medieval societies, how certain scientists, let's say, were persecuted at the hands of certain religious institutions or traditional institutions because their ideas broke orthodoxy. We can also see this in how perhaps in contemporary academic circles the study of the humanities is often belittled and disrespected. There's an assumption that people who study the humanities are somehow less intelligent or they don't really contribute anything useful to society. Meanwhile, those who study the natural sciences are seen as the end all and be all of productive, efficient, polite society. It really is a shame that we've essentially made certain subjects taboo to study in certain societies. Whether it be the natural sciences, philosophy and metaphysics, or the humanities, for me personally at least, all subjects and all disciplines of learning are worth of preservation and are worthy of being preserved and continued on as part of the broader human legacy, because wisdom and knowledge can come from anywhere. And it's quite naive and foolish to ignore whole disciplines of learning because you think that one subject is better than another. I see this attitude sometimes amongst certain religious people. For example, I see this amongst my community, for example, amongst the Muslims or amongst people from an immigrant background, where they belittle the study of the humanities and they tend to focus on natural science. For those of a more religious predisposition, for some reason, and it's quite sad actually, they somehow seem to think that the study of things like philosophy and the humanities are somehow just inherently more dangerous to their beliefs than the study of the natural sciences. And they think that by studying the natural sciences, it's inherently somehow going to keep their faith safer. But the irony of ironies is that, if anything, without philosophical, metaphysical, and spiritual grounding, the natural sciences often become a birth ground for things like atheism and for things like disbelief in religion. I'm not saying this to impose a religious worldview on my viewers, and I'm not saying that people have to study the natural sciences through a philosophical lens that is conducive to their faith. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying and pointing out very simply is that these assumptions that people have are very flawed, and if anything, they're doing themselves a disservice and they're doing their own traditions and religions a disservice if they seriously think that the study of some subjects is better than others, or studying some subjects is somehow going to get them further away from their idea of a god or their idea of piety. For example, many fundamentalists tended to be quite trained in the natural sciences, in STEM subjects, in engineering, for example, but they don't seem to realize that without grounding within the philosophical traditions of their faith systems, in particular, within the spiritual systems of their faith systems, and without any grounding in the humanities, these subjects can become breeding grounds for tyranny. For example, they can become breeding grounds for things, for arguments that go against faith itself, that go against ideas of religion. For example, amongst the new atheist movement, you may have noticed that many of its leading thinkers are scientists, are engineers, are mathematicians. They are people trained in the STEM subjects. and they tend to have zero to none training in things like the humanities, in things like philosophy, in things like metaphysics. And this is why, for example, they often make very weird mistakes at times when it comes to philosophy, despite them being very excellent scientists and excellent thinkers in their own right. And so it's very incorrect for certain religious people to think that somehow the natural sciences will inherently be more conducive to their faith, and so indirectly or even directly belittle and degrade the study of the humanities. My point here isn't to say that we should study the humanities for religious reasons, or that we shouldn't approach the natural sciences. I'm saying that we need to approach all the sciences, all the various disciplines of humanity with respect and with the honor that they deserve. And it's also quite tragic to see sometimes even atheists fall for this, where atheists will belittle not necessarily atheists, but people of a disposition perhaps which is against religion, or where they aren't so conducive to religion or things like tradition, or they are more scientifically minded, let's just say. For people who are more scientifically minded, let's just say more broadly, they also tend to be quite dismissive of things like religion, theology, philosophy, and the humanities. And they tend to downplay those things. Especially when it comes to things like philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. They are quite dismissive and sometimes even very harsh towards them. And it's very sad to see, even for example, somebody like Richard Dawkins, who otherwise is a very famous and celebrated, as he should be, scientist. He's an academic with his own qualifications, and whatever you think about Richard Dawkins, without a doubt, he is one of the most influential thinkers of recent times. And of course, I can respect anybody who sticks his head out and talks his mind. But undoubtedly, Richard Dawkins falls into many mistakes regarding religion, and he falls into many mistakes regarding theology because he isn't necessarily trained in theology himself, he isn't necessarily trained in philosophy himself, but he approaches things from the perspective of a scientist. And so he, indirectly, the new atheist movement, with their very heavy emphasis on the STEM subjects, sometimes tends to downplay the importance of the humanities and philosophy and metaphysics. And it's a shame to see, obviously, that academics who are otherwise worthy of being celebrated and have numerous qualifications and have done enormous good for the academy, that they often fall into such blind spots and such errors. And so it's not fair to downplay one subject or one study for the sake of another, or to just put one subject on a pedestal and just to ignore everything else. Unfortunately, people just glorify their ignorance in the name of whatever it may be, and it leads to very dangerous consequences for society because truth can be found anywhere ultimately. And to restrict yourself to one area of study is essentially to restrict your ability to grasp the truth as a whole. Remember, the truth is multifaceted, complex, nuanced, and all of the various disciplines of humanity and all of the various subjects that are studied within the broader human tradition, not just specific to one society, let's say, or one institution, helps us to gain a better understanding of the truth and of the world as it exists and of reality in general. I see a concerning trend, especially amongst certain online circles, and especially amongst some of the online right, especially, where there's growing ethno nationalism. There are increasing trends of anti intellectualism, but also there's a willingness to be ignorant of different cultures, different traditions, different religions. And of course, this isn't specific to just, let's say, white nationalists. Different kinds of nationalists and different kinds of ideologies across the world in general, which may be exclusionary in nature, tend to unfortunately share this trait. But they tend to be very exclusionary towards other traditions or other religions or other cultures, and as a result, they purposefully seek to be ignorant of them. And they do this in a variety of ways, but one way, which is very insidious, is to provide misrepresentations, misinterpretations, or caricatures of these cultures, to present them as evil, backwards, and barbaric, and as a result, to say that they are not worthy of our attention and time. It's a very dangerous trend, and one that just ignores the broader human tradition for the sake of focusing on your own tradition. Again, I am not arguing against the fact that people have separate cultures, separate values, separate traditions that they might find valuable to themselves specifically because of the fact that they belong to them. But this doesn't mean that we should ignore or just completely disregard or consider backwards the traditions of other societies, because they are part of the broader human experience and are part of the broader human legacy as well. And truth surely cannot be restricted to one geographical location. I mean, we are all human beings and we all intuitively are coming to terms with how the world is and how reality is. So, surely, how on earth could truth just be limited to one geographical location? It doesn't make sense. And yet, some amongst the online right may have this troubling trend. Also, just to, not be impartial to one group, let's say, and just to focus on one group, there are people across the political spectrum in general, right? Whether it be on the left, on the right, whether it be authoritarian or libertarian, who are generally speaking stuck in their own echo chambers. And as a result, they don't understand the arguments of the other side. Not only do they not understand the arguments and the perspective of the other side, they purposefully misinterpret and provide caricatures of their opponents, and they present them as the worst possible stereotypes that they could possibly be without actually trying to understand what it is that they are saying. And this is just echo chamber glorified ignorance. As a whole, whatever ideology you may be from, whatever religion you may be from, whatever background you may be from, there's a growing concerning trend across the political spectrum, especially on certain online spaces and amongst different groups, to glorify ignorance, to glorify misconceptions of the other, to glorify misunderstandings of the other, and to present caricatures of them. And this is leading to a very toxic discourse where people don't want to learn for the sake of knowing the truth and understanding the world as it is and trying to gain a better understanding of the world and to try to seek knowledge, which really and truly is one of the purposes of life. One of our missions as humans in this life really is to seek knowledge. But on the other hand, we have now been so heavily distracted and so heavily radicalized that we would rather glorify our own ignorance than come to terms with it and try to seek knowledge as a result.